Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of January 27th, and this is your Monday briefing. Here's what's happening this week. The House is not in session this week, with House Republicans at a policy retreat in Miami. The Senate will continue to focus on advancing President Trump's nominations, including Scott Bessent to be Treasury Secretary. Congressional appropriators are expected to hold bipartisan negotiations on government funding for the remainder of FY25, with the current short-term funding measure set to expire March 14th. President Trump will address a joint session of Congress on March 4th, and tax filing season is underway as of today. Sindhu?
So a lot going on, Scott.
Indeed.
And here to share his thoughts and what he's hearing about some of it is Todd Metcalf. Todd, welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So one of the topics that we are very focused on is budget reconciliation. And the Republicans are at a retreat this week. And I want to find out from you where this is going to go and if negotiations can be resolved with the Senate and where energy credits and the SALT tax, where that factors into this conversation.
Thanks, Sindhu. Well, I think that at the end of the day, what you have is a very big bill, one big beautiful bill, as the president has described it. And having one big beautiful bill where the House, I think, is proposing to instruct perhaps as many as 10 congressional committees on reconciliation, there are complexities. I think that the goal that the Speaker has laid out is to try to resolve as many of those differences as possible during this retreat, to sort of try to leave Florida and come back to Washington with a blueprint that the Budget Committee can then execute. But there are lots of open questions, including, as you raised, what to do about the IRA energy credits, what to do about the SALT cap. Last fall, you had 18 Republicans in the House saying, hey, don't think about getting rid of all the IRA credits. Now, I think that the IRA credits will probably be curbed or limited, or there'll be some modifications to them, but not likely to be fully repealed. But maybe they'll get further down the road on exactly what they're trying to do this week. On a SALT cap, you've got a dozen or so members of the House Republican Conference who are very interested in seeing some SALT relief. Even President Trump on the campaign trail said that maybe we need to revisit the SALT question. I do think both of those issues are going to be, a part of the solution going forward. But there are a lot of open questions on reconciliation, and it'll be interesting to see how far along they are once they leave Florida this week.
Todd, we mentioned at the top that March 14th is the funding deadline for the government to stay open. And with all else that's going on, like we just mentioned with reconciliation, how do we expect to see that proceed? And could it also include, say, a debt ceiling deal?
Well, I think that you're exactly right to sort of think about it as a combo meal, if you will, from a fiscal perspective, because we know that the House and Senate appropriators have been meeting. Their goal is to have a top line agreement, in other words, an overall, probably defense, non-defense top line numbers. By the end of the month, which is the end of this week. So they've got their work cut out for them, particularly when you consider that at least House Republicans are not in town. I know they have phones, they can talk, but still. Sure. So they're focused on that. After they get that top line number, it's still probably going to take them at least a month to sort of figure out what are the allocations under those numbers, what riders, et cetera. So they've got a path forward. And then the president has met with congressional leadership, as I understand it, and said, hey, I want to get the debt ceiling dealt with as soon as possible. And I think they sort of heard that as, well, the next bipartisan opportunity is likely to be on spending. Sure. So we don't think that we're going to we're not going to reach the X date by March 14th. Mm-hmm. But I do think that date, that sort of opportunity to come together on bipartisan matters, on a bipartisan basis, I should say, I think that does represent an opportunity to sort of deal with the debt limit. Mm-hmm. The question is, how are they going to deal with it? What is the deal that's going to be struck? We know that the last time we struck a deal on the debt limit, it proved rather fatal for the then speaker. Sure. So I think Speaker Johnson and others have to sort of be thinking about, okay, we got to deal with the debt limit, right, but we have to be careful about how we do it. But I do think that March is an opportunity to deal with it. Will they get it done? We'll see.
All right, another area that we were really focused on last week were the executive orders having to do with international tax. So House Ways and Means Chairman Jason Smith introduced a bill under which foreign companies and investors would have an increased U.S. tax rate if their respective countries were disproportionately taxing U.S. entities. So what is the likelihood of this bill getting passed? And if it passes, when could it take effect?
The bill that Chairman Smith has introduced, and then which would create this new Section 899 that would basically impose sort of penalties, punitive rates on companies that are headquartered in countries that engage in discriminatory tax practices against the United States. I guess that's a short way of describing it, including their executives. So not just the companies, but their executives, others that. So it's a significant threat. I think it's a very real threat. There are some questions because of the way it's structured, as it's currently written, whether it would be able to make its way through reconciliation, because the Byrd Rule and the fact that it would seem to override tax treaties, and so there's some questions about how that would work with the Byrd Rule and reconciliation. But look, I think that the threat of having these bills enacted is very real. And we certainly, based on the executive action that we've seen out of the administration, we have a president that it seems to me would sign such legislation. So I think that our trading partners around the world have to take that sort of threat of tax retribution seriously. Sure. In terms of when it could take effect, Congress can make a law effective whenever it wants to. So it could pass it on, whenever it passes a reconciliation bill, it could say this is effective today. It doesn't do this very frequently. It could say it's effective retroactively, or it could, push it forward to whatever date. But Congress can decide when it becomes effective. Certainly they have a willingness and I would think a political interest in protecting the tax sovereignty of the United States against these foreign incursions, if you will, against the U.S. fisc. So I think it's a real threat.
Todd, there's a U.S.-Taiwan tax bill making its way through Congress that would deal with double taxation between the two jurisdictions. What's the prognosis for that bill, and does it have the potential to carry any other tax issues along with it?
Well, it barely passed the House last week. I think there was one person who voted against it, so it was a close call. They really had to whip that thing. So it's clearly enjoys very broad bipartisan support. We know that Chairman Crapo and Senator Wyden in the Senate also support both the bill and getting it done. The bill that we're talking about was actually a part of the Smith-Wyden agreement that didn't get any traction to get done last year. So clearly there's bipartisan support for getting this done. I think that the question is really a matter of, first, when is there going to be time on the Senate calendar? They're busy now approving nominees. They've got that unique function, so that sort of keeps them busy at the first of an administration. So when is there an opportunity? If it's going to pass the Senate, though, it's likely to pass the Senate under unanimous consent, which means that if they could get everyone together, they could pass it in 30 seconds. So it's not really about we're going to spend a week on this thing. But I do think I think it has a very good opportunity, a very good likelihood of getting done. The question is, does it get done very soon, or is it sometime later in the year?
All right, Todd, last question, and my favorite question. What are some things that you think companies should be considering in the week ahead? Get us to a point of focus.
I mean, I think we have a new administration. They're very active. We've seen all manner of executive action. We've seen Congress beginning to not just move on nominees, but moving legislation, putting the administration officials in place to sort of get the ball rolling. I think that companies really, frankly, need to pay attention to the headlines, see what's happening, not just in tax, but outside of tax, in terms of what is this administration doing? This is not a slow roll. I mean, they're making a lot of moves very quickly. I think one of the first things that companies should be focused on this week in particular is, does the House actually come out of its retreat, does the House GOP come out of its retreat with a blueprint for reconciliation? Because if they do, and they start moving on it, then I think, we're going to have to be focused then on the details. And that's going to be much more quickly than perhaps we normally would anticipate. But I do think that, look, they know where their risks are. They have to pay attention to is Congress going to impose additional tax on me, in what way, et cetera, but really just focus on what Congress is doing and what the administration is doing. And that's a lot, but I mean, that's really where they need to be paying attention.
Okay.
No surprises.
Todd, as always, thank you so much for being here and for your insight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And a note for our viewers, the latest Week in Review is in the description of this episode, along with episodes addressing executive orders and PwC's 2025 tax policy outlook.
There's also a link to an interview with Chris Desmond on trade and tariffs. We appreciate you spending this time with us. Take care.